Our scripture lesson this morning comes from the Gospel of Luke, chapter 10, verses 38 through 42. Now, as they went on their way, Jesus entered a certain village where a woman named Martha welcomed him into her home. She had a sister named Mary who sat at the Lord's feet and listened to what he was saying. But Martha was distracted by her many tasks, so she came to him and asked, "Lord, do you not care that my sister has left me to do all the work by myself? Tell her then to help me." But the Lord answered her, "Martha, Martha, you are worried and distracted by many things. There is need of only one thing. Mary has chosen the better part, which will not be taken away from her."
Now, when I was a young kid, I loved Valentine's Day. Now, humor me for a minute, because I know we're in the middle of July here, but I liked Valentine's Day. Now, not because of all the romantic, mushy stuff. Yuck. I mean, that stuff's gross when you're in elementary school. However, I'll admit it, taking Valentine's Day cards to school was sort of a fun thing to do. I don't really remember the specifics of any of the cards that I used to take to my friends at school when it came to be Valentine's Day, but I'm sure they had some of my favorite cartoon characters on them. And being a child of the 80s, those were probably characters such as He-Man, or maybe the Transformers. Surely you remember the Transformers, you know, those cool robots that can turn into cars or trucks or airplanes or, well, you remember the Transformers and you get the picture. But you know, it wasn't even really the Valentine's Day cards that made Valentine's Day fun for me. What I really looked forward to, and there may be a few of you here that can identify with this, were those small pastel chalky heart candies. The ones with a little slogan stamped on them in red food. You know, things like, "Love me," "Be mine," "You and me," "Kiss me," and so on. Now, I don't know what it is about those little heart candies and how something so simple became so iconic, but they certainly are a mainstay of the Valentine's Day season. In fact, you know, I looked this up on Wikipedia, and according to Wikipedia, the first heart candies to be printed with these little slogans appeared in 1866, which would be 150 years ago this year. And one of the main companies that makes the Sweetheart brand, you've probably seen the box that says Sweetheart on it, that's made by a company from New England called Necco. And they produce approximately 2 billion Sweetheart candies every single year. Now, that's a lot of little hearts. But anyway, I loved those little candies, and I couldn't get enough of them. Until one year. Now, it must have been around 4th grade, and somehow we ended up with a jumbo bag of those conversation hearts in our pantry. And I don't know if we purchased them for a party or for me to take to school along with my Valentine's Day cards, but whatever the reason, we had this entire jumbo bag just tucked away in our pantry. So one fine day, I thought it would be a really good idea when I was looking for a snack to grab that bag. And I just grabbed it and I started eating. Now, I must have eaten over half the bag before I realized that this was a huge mistake. Those little chalky candies are not what you want to imbibe in large quantities. Needless to say, my stomach began to turn, and I really just started to feel terrible. And I don't know how long I was sick to my stomach, but I know it felt like an eternity. And to this day, I want nothing to do with those little pastel crusties. What had been so good to me was suddenly not so tasty. And as the saying goes, I'd had too much of a good thing. Now, you might protest my characterization there and say, well, candy isn't really all that good of a thing. It's not healthy for you. It rots your teeth, which you get no argument from my dentist wife on. Not to mention, a lot of you are probably thinking, those candies are pretty nasty anyway. Fair on all counts. But still, those candies were good to me until I overdid it. And the saying, too much of a good thing, is so well known because the principle holds true in so many instances. Now, perhaps candy is not a particularly good thing, but let's take something like an activity, like exercise. Surely exercise is a good activity. It keeps our circulatory system healthy, our muscles toned, and so much more. And yet we know at the same time that if we excessively exercise and overdo it, we can actually cause damage to our bodies. Or take an even more fundamental example of something good. What could be better than water? Our bodies are made up of up to 70% water. And we can't go for more than 3 days without water before we perish. And yet, did you know you can drink too much water? Have you heard that? It's true. Now, it rarely happens because a person has to intentionally drink gallons and gallons of water for this to happen. And it has to happen in a short amount of time. But it's true. In an extreme instance, a person can drink too much water, resulting in a condition called hyponatremia, which is an imbalance of sodium levels that can actually be lethal. Now, this is not something to get worried about. Like I said, it's extremely rare, but still, it's the very definition of too much of a good thing. Now, in today's gospel reading, we are presented with the story of Jesus' visit to the home of Martha. And Martha and her sister Mary were followers of Jesus, and they appear in multiple places in the New Testament, both in the book of Luke and in the book of John. In this particular passage, Jesus is the honored guest in the home of Martha. And appropriate to Jesus' call to his followers to receive him and his followers, and also in an appropriate concern for hospitality, Martha is taking care of a number of tasks. Now, we aren't really told what kinds of tasks, but we can sort of surmise the kinds of things that would go into hosting someone that was really an important guest in our own house. And we can really think about what work it would take if they were bringing a whole entourage along with them. In fact, the Greek word used for her serving work, diakonia, forms the root of words we still use today to indicate ministerial service, such as the word deacon. Like in our church we have deacons. This is not mindless work that Martha is up to. It's not just mindless housework. This is careful, intentional preparation for and service to Jesus and his followers. She is taking part in the ministry herself through this work. Now, as I think about Martha here, I'm reminded of my maternal grandmother. Anytime there was a major holiday or a special occasion, we would all gather at her house for celebration. And when we walked in the door, we were always greeted with the smell of foods coming off the stove and the clanks and clatters of plates and pans and dishes being filled and placed on the serving table. We always knew it was time to eat, though, when we smelled the bread burning. Yes, that's right. Mimi always, and we call her Mimi always burned the bread. So that might be kind of bad, but the good thing was it was also a sign that everything else was ready and it was time to eat. So then we would have the prayer, fill our plates, and gather around the dining room table. And every time we gathered around for one of these meals, there was one constant feature. Mimi never set a place for herself. The routine was always the same. We would all take our places, everyone would start eating, and then someone, usually my mother or my uncle, would say, "Now where's Mimi going to sit?" And then Mimi would always say something like, "Don't worry about me, just go ahead and eat." And then she would continue going to and from the kitchen, making sure everyone else had what they needed. And no matter how much we would protest, she would insist we tend to our eating and our conversation. It was important to her that she take care of us well, and it was good work in many ways. It was her way of loving us. And yet at the same time, she probably missed out on a lot of good conversations and time with us. Now, eventually, somebody would vacate their place, usually one of the young grandchildren, and then she would join us at the table, take her seat, enter into the conversation, and begin eating. She never completely forgot that what was most important was time spent in each other's presence. And furthermore, much of her work facilitated our ability to be gathered together. And yet there were still times where it took a little nudge to get her to join us. She was involved in good work that facilitated even better things, such as our time together. But sometimes her good work kept her away from the better parts. Martha, too, was involved in good work. Work that made it possible for Jesus and his followers to have a place to stay, to have food, to be able to teach. Sometimes this story actually bothers people when they read it, because if you read it a certain way, it can sound as if Jesus is dismissive of Martha's work. If Martha is distracted and Mary has really chosen the better part, does that mean Jesus is saying that what Martha is doing is lesser or not good? And furthermore, it's as if Jesus does not appreciate all the work that Martha has done, as if her contributions maybe mean little. Besides, doesn't somebody have to do the work? Now, if we frame it this way, the story seems to diminish Martha's work, pitting sister against sister and action against listening. However, I would like to suggest that we listen to Jesus' message to Martha as something more akin to when my mother or uncle would ask my Mimi to sit down with us at the dinner table. Their pleas came not from their dismissal of my grandmother or her work, but rather as an affirmation and an appreciation of all she had done and of all of who she was. They wanted her to enjoy the fullness of that time together, time that was made possible in part by her work. And likewise, I think Jesus was nudging Martha, reminding her of the reason for her work, to welcome Jesus into her house and to welcome Jesus into their midst. Now, she had done that and she had done it well, but now might be the time to sit with her guest. So I think it's incorrect to read this story as diminishing the importance of Martha's work or good efforts to show love and hospitality in general. In fact, it's really important to note that this story follows right on the heels of Jesus' telling of the parable of the Good Samaritan. And so that story, if none other, demonstrates the importance of care, hospitality to strangers, and love in action. No, Jesus is not diminishing Martha's good works, but he is suggesting that maybe some of those works at this time have run their course. They've served their purpose. They've opened the door to something better. Should Martha choose to join her sister at Jesus' feet, and we don't know, it doesn't say what happened, she will come into the presence of the source of goodness and mercy. Perhaps Jesus is even hoping to teach her so as to invite her and prepare her for even greater aspects of ministry. No, I don't think Jesus diminishes her work, but I think he challenges her to see that her good works might run the risk of becoming too much of a good thing, shortchanging her encounter with Christ and keeping her from seeing the fuller picture of what God intends for her to know and to do. Now, where part of Martha's story reminds me of my grandmother Mimi, another part of the story reminds me of times I have spent with my two daughters. And that would be the part where Martha comes to ask for Mary's help and tries to enlist Jesus' affirmation that she's right to come and ask. Just as Jesus is caught in this triangulation between these two sisters, I often find myself in that situation between my two daughters. It goes something like this. Perhaps I tell my daughters that they need to pick up the mess of toys that they have left in the living room. So, they start to get to work, begrudgingly, but they start to do their task, and as they're getting near the end of the task, let's say one of my daughters, we'll say Emerson, she proceeds down the hallway to put away a lot of the toys that they've gathered up. And while she's gone, I happen to glance over and I notice, man, that shoe rack is really messy too. And so then, I say to my other daughter, Miriam, I say, Miriam, since the living room's almost clean, why don't you go on over to the shoe rack and start to work over there, because I need your help over there. Well, inevitably, you know what happens. Emerson comes traipsing back from her room into the living room. She sees Miriam's not there. She goes looking for her. She finds Miriam at the shoe rack and she says, Miriam, you're not doing what you're supposed to be doing. And then she comes to me to enlist my support and to say, Dad, Miriam's not doing what you told her to do. And unfortunately for Emerson, I have to tell her, actually, Miriam's doing exactly what I told her to do. I've asked you both to do something. And what she's doing is good, too. Now, I believe that Martha was caught in this same situation, convinced that because what she was doing was worthy and right, that what her sister Mary was doing had to be wrong, or at the very least, not the best thing to be doing. Frankly, this is human nature, to assume that we have it all just right, or if we're trying to be humble about it, maybe we don't have it all just right, but at least we're better off than them. If only they would follow our good example, everything would be so much better. Here's another level of the idea of too much of a good thing. But this time I would like us to think of good thing good thing, in quotes, as a unit. This good thing is not necessarily good at all. It's our preoccupation with the good thing. In other words, our being good in opposition to someone else's being bad or wrong. Now, I'm not suggesting, certainly not suggesting, that there aren't good and bad things to do and be, or right and wrong don't exist. But simply that we have to be careful because we don't always judge those things as well as we might think, which is a challenge to all of us in our interactions with those with whom we share the world. We want so badly to put ourselves in the category of the good and the right, and others in the category of the bad and the wrong. And in this instance, Jesus doesn't let Martha off the hook quite that easily. When Martha comes to tell her sister to help and tries to solicit Jesus' affirmation, she is basically asking Jesus to tell her that she is right and that her sister is wrong. But Jesus doesn't do that. Instead, he invites Martha to see that what Mary is doing is right and good. And as I mentioned earlier, this does not have to be to the diminishment of the goodness of what Martha was doing. Rather than affirm Martha, though, in her rightness, of which she's already well convinced, Jesus affirms Mary in the rightness of what she is doing. And this is quite an unexpected turn in the story. Martha is challenged to see the value of Mary's response to Jesus. Martha is invited to consider other possibilities for responding to the presence of Christ. She's invited to turn her focus away from her own attempts at rightness to the righteousness of Christ. She's invited to leave her hasty judgment of her sister behind and consider Mary and Mary's behavior from Jesus' perspective. And the truth is, Jesus' perspective must always be our beginning point if we hope to come anywhere close to sharing in God's goodness, in God's righteousness, in God's mercy, and in God's love. And we only come to know Jesus' perspective if we draw close to Jesus to listen, to learn, and to grow. Now, I believe this is a crucial takeaway from this story, an important one today. In multiple ways, this story demonstrates that human attempts at goodness or doing the right thing often fail to live up to the fullness of God's goodness and God's divine purposes. On one level, we see that just because an action or a task or an initiative might be good, that does not mean that it's right at every time or appropriate in every measure. And sometimes too much of one good activity can keep us from being aware of others to which Jesus might be calling us. And then on a second level, we see that the human tendency to want to prove our goodness runs the risk of actually separating us from others and even from God. Goodness and righteousness do not come first by our own effort or our being innately good, but rather from our encounter with God, who loves us, forgives us, heals us, and then, yes, empowers us by the Spirit to live lives that are better, more holy, more righteous than we might ever achieve or imagine on our own. So our focus must first and foremost be on the God who is already working in the world to redeem us and all of creation. Now, it's been pretty much impossible to think or write about a sermon without reflecting on the events in our midst the past couple of weeks. And as I think about how our country has been swept up in a tumultuous tide of the evils of racism and violence and fear and death, after the tragic shooting deaths of Alton Sterling in Louisiana, Philando Castillo in Michigan, and then officers Brent Thompson, Patrick Zamarripa, Michael Kroll, Lauren Aarons, and Michael Smith in Dallas, we have seen protests and counter-protests, cries for justice and love. All of us are wondering, what can we do? And what should we do? Is there a better way forward? And as we ponder such questions, perhaps we would do well to consider these lessons we've gleaned from Martha and Mary's story. First, we must always be ready to move beyond the status quo. Much as Martha's work was good at one level, so too we are involved in good work in the name of Christ. And indeed, through our personal faith lives and our church lives, we have served others, comforted the sick, fed the hungry, and welcomed the stranger. We have been and are doing the work to which Christ has called us. And however, that does not mean that Christ is done with us, and that there aren't new things to learn and new challenges to confront. if we fail to pay attention to where Christ may be calling us to something new, perhaps in this instance to the deep work of confronting evils that affect not only our personal lives, but our systems of governance and society as well, we may miss out on the broader mission into which Jesus is calling us, a mission that includes peace with justice. For many of us, that might mean pausing from the normal work that we're used to doing and asking what it is to which Christ is calling us at this critical moment in time, both individually and as the church. And second, we must be on guard against that constrictive tendency to box people into these categories of complete goodness and badness or exclusively right and wrong action. As we strive to come together across many divides, including age, race, religion, sexual differences, political affiliation, and more, the measure by which we weigh people's intentions and their actions cannot be a simple comparison to our own perceived goodness. We must be willing to look past our own limited perspective, to not try to draw Jesus in to make Jesus see how right we are all the time, but rather we must approach our Christ with a willingness to see things from Jesus' perspective. When we allow ourselves a true encounter with the God that we know in Christ, who is calling us to sit at his feet and listen, we gain better insight into what it means to truly love with righteousness, justice, and mercy. And then third, we must pay attention and listen closely to others in our midst. We have much to learn from one another. And if the gospel teaches us anything, it also teaches us that we encounter Christ in the stranger, the downtrodden, the hurting, the ignored, the oppressed, and all sorts of other persons. In her encounter with Jesus, when Martha is frustrated with her sister and wants to tell her how wrong she is, Jesus reveals the goodness of Mary's intent and Mary's action too. Suddenly, Martha not only sees Jesus more clearly, but sees her sister in a new light as well. If we allow ourselves to be present with Christ, Christ reveals what true love and righteousness and peace and goodness really look like. And furthermore, we begin to see how God is already at work in the world and continues to work in surprising ways and through surprising people, and perhaps even inviting us to new and surprising works as well. But it all begins with what God reveals as good, right, and just. It all begins with God's constant initiative to save us all and to save creation. It all begins with the work of the Spirit empowering us to live in ways that we can never imagine or accomplish on our own. In an excerpt from his forthcoming book on confronting and preaching about racism, United Methodist Bishop Will Willimon, who's a fantastic preacher as well, suggests that before we consider the ethical question of what ought we to do, we must begin with the questions that are truly formative for us as Christians. Who is God, and what does the Lord require of us? He goes on to explain, and I quote him, "Human action is responsive reaction to God's initiatives. Our discipleship is our human affirmation of how God is already busy in the world. It is not for us to defeat the sin of racism, and you could say many other sins. But he says God in Christ is already doing that. But our chief ethical question is, will I join with Christ in his world-changing, world-ending resurrection work or not? In difficult times such as these, when we are reaching for better answers, when we are asking what it is we should think, we should feel, and we should do, I think Willimon's advice is really helpful. Let's begin by asking, who is this God we claim to love and serve? What is this God up to in the world? How is the God that we know and we come to here today to worship already at work defeating hatred and fear and racism and violence and all sorts of evil? Who does this God love? And what does this Lord require of us? Only then do the things we ought to do start to become more clear. So let us take our place at the feet of Jesus with Mary, not so we can show God what we are already doing or what we believe to be right, but to let God love us, teach us, and guide us in the ways that lead to even better things. Then, and only then, may we go about the work of God with Martha's passion and determination. May we love who and what God loves. May we have the mind of Christ in us, and may the Spirit work in us that we might act more justly, love more mercifully, and walk more humbly with our God. With God as the focus and the center of our lives, we find the source of goodness of which there is never too much. And only by God's grace can we then begin to maybe heed the advice printed on millions of those little sweetheart candies each year. Be good. Love him. Love her. Real love. Go, go, go. Start now. Thanks be to God.